And now we're going to hit record in three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. As you know, I'm a major historian. I just love history and learning how things came to be. That's why, if you are like me, you're going to like this podcast episode. The individual that we're interviewing today wrote a book called Uncommon Grounds: The History of Coffee and How It Transformed Our World. I drink at least 2 cups every day, so it's going to be fascinating to learn about what transpired to make this so accessible to the world. So, Mark Pendergrast, thank you so much for being here, man.
Thank you.
Let's start off with the genesis of the book. Now, you have multiple books out there, some of them somewhat controversial, I believe. And what made you want to write this book? What sparked your curiosity?
Well, I actually had pretty bad coffee growing up. I'm a baby boomer, and it was either instant or percolated. And I had written a book about Coca-Cola called For God, Country, and Coca-Cola, which involved all kinds of interesting topics, including uh, consumerism, advertising, uh, environmental issues, social inequality, etc. And I was looking for another topic like that. So I didn't really write about coffee because I was a coffee lover. It was because I had uh, I was looking for another topic where social and political issues were important and a product that people cared deeply about. And coffee certainly fit that bill. And when I looked into whether somebody had written a history of it, I found that the last history had been written in the 1950s. And so I thought, well, this is fascinating, and it's got a lot longer history than Coca-Cola, which started in 1886. So I thought that would be an interesting topic.
Hmm. And so, um, your background, you're just a, it seems like you have many books. Like, what got you into? Were you just an historian by nature? What made you fall in love with documenting some of these incredible, I guess you could say, inventions or products that the world kind of runs on?
Well, I was an English major in college, and then I started writing for local newspapers and magazines, and I was very interested in people and how they came to be where they were, and I became more and more interested in the history of how things came to be the way they were. So I ended up writing about topics such as I mentioned, Coca-Cola and coffee, and I did a history of mirrors. So I like to look at relatively narrow topics that have wide applications.
Gotcha. And so, can you give our listeners and viewers the quick little rundown? Maybe I know it's not going to be quick, but I mean, there are many stories that I've heard of how we found coffee, and when it comes to whether it was certain type of cattle or sheep or goats, basically coming across the original, I guess, the coffee bean, and it was almost like there was all types of energy and all type of I don't know if it was just they had more energy throughout the day, and that's whenever they realized that the coffee bean had some type of power, I guess, and people started to brew it
Yeah,
within the water. So,
nobody is really sure how coffee was originally discovered. There are some indications that tribes knew about it as far back as 1000 AD, that you could grind the seeds, uh, the hard seeds from this plant up and put them in with animal fat and consume them for energy on long voyages. But it wasn't until sometime in the 1400s that people figured out that you could roast the seeds and grind them up and put them in hot water for an infusion. And how that happened, no one is quite certain. The story that I retold in the book and that you're referring to is of Kaldi, the goat herd in the mountains of Ethiopia,
yes, Ethiopia, right?
who saw his goats dancing around and acting weird, and he noticed that they were eating the berries from this understory tree. And so he tried some himself, and he started dancing and reciting poetry. And then he told the people in the town, and the imams were looking for something to keep them awake for their midnight prayers. And so they adopted it. The, it's possible that goats had something to do with it, because there really are goats that still roam wild in the mountains of Ethiopia. But my theory is that it did probably start with religious observances, such as many tropical products do. They become, these tropical products originated because they formed things that are hallucinogenic, or influence our brains. But what they're really intended to do is to fend off pesticides, is to keep their sort of poisons.
Really?
It's true of cocaine or chocolate or any of those things. They're meant to fend off predators, and they're fairly successful at that until you begin to grow a monoculture, and then they uh, they they're predators which figure out how to take advantage of it anyway, and this happens all over the world with all kinds of things. That's how antibiotic resistance happens and things like that. At any rate, coffee became an institution in Ethiopia, and then it went across to the Red Sea to Yemen, and they began to grow it there. The Arabs had a monopoly on coffee for quite some time. They didn't want anyone else to be able to grow it anywhere else, and so they would parboil the beans to prevent them from being grown anywhere else. Eventually, of course, the monopoly was broken. There was a Indian named Baba Budan who, sometime in the 1500s, managed to smuggle some out. The Dutch managed to get some fertile beans and began to grow them in their greenhouses in Amsterdam. And eventually, a Frenchman got hold of some of those and took a coffee plant to Martinique. And that's how it was introduced to the Western Hemisphere in the early 1700s.
Wow.
So it all became quite basically, coffee spread within a century to most continents in a sort of a band around the equator between the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer. And it had some good influences and it had some bad influences. The coffee houses became places called penny universities in England, because the men who went to the coffee houses came from all kinds of walks of life. You could have these fantastic conversations. Uh, Only men were allowed to go into the coffee houses, by the way. Uh, so it was not totally egalitarian in Europe. Women could go into them, but the coffee houses became places where you could plan businesses. Lloyd's of London began, and Lloyd's Coffee House,
Which is the
where you,
largest insurance company in the world, am I right?
yes, and
So,
where the poets would meet, people would write seditious verses. Uh, the king tried to close the coffee houses of London because he said that they were a bad influence. There were all kinds of rumors spread about coffee early on. there was a women's petition against coffee in 1683 in England that said that it was making their men impotent, that come they would come home from the coffee houses with nothing standing but their ears and nothing moist but their nostrils. They were complaining that they were impotent when they came home. The men answered with a defense saying that it actually added a spiritual essency to their sperm and that it was really a wonderful product. Um, the king was unable to close the coffee houses because there would have been a revolt probably, and his father had been beheaded. This was King Charles II. So he took it back and allowed the coffee houses to go on. Um, but they also had a very bad effect because in many places, coffee, which is a very difficult product to grow, the trees have to be pruned, they have to be tended, they have to be very carefully picked. You have to pick only the ripest cherries, which means that you have to go repeatedly back and not just strip the branches off. And so in places like India, they forced the lower classes to work in places like the East Indies and the West Indies. They forced slaves to grow the coffee. And eventually, by 1791, about half, believe it or not, of the world's coffee was being grown on the island of San Domingo, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And but it was being grown under terrible conditions where slaves were being killed often for not obeying their masters and hung upside down, and the women were raped. And so in 1791, there was the first slave revolt in what we now call Haiti. And it was the world's first successful slave revolt. And it was sort of ironic because that same coffee had been consumed in the coffee houses of France, where they were planning the French Revolution, and where people had, been inspired to revolution, but over many cups of coffee, which notoriously makes people, think more clearly and be more, you
Awake and
know,
aware.
willing to take part in revolutions.
It's unbelievable. Okay, so 1791, things start to. That's unreal that we didn't really experience the I guess the enthusiasm for coffee until very late. You know, what you're saying is that this first started, I think you said 1400 and then 1500. Um, Baba or Badu or whatever his name was the one
Baba
that based.
Budan.
Yeah. So he's the one that brought it over, or started to get it out of his country, or into a new country. And so, how did it become commercialized? Now, you wrote a book about Coca-Cola, and I know that Coca-Cola had an incredible genesis, right? And how they became the greatest marketers the world has ever seen, I believe, up until that point. So, was there a moment where it just caught fire and people started to commercialize it?
There was not one moment, but in America, the Boston Tea Party was in 1773, and up until then, we had been primarily a tea drinking country.
Yep.
Um, it became sort of unpatriotic at that point to drink tea, and so we began to switch towards coffee, which was being grown closer by in the Caribbean at that point. But during the 1800s, coffee began to be grown in huge amounts in Brazil. It became the world's largest producer of coffee, and it
It still
still
is though,
is.
right? Yeah, yeah, very nice. Okay.
Mhm. And so coffee became cheaper uh, for Americans, and it became really a sort of a cowboy coffee culture where people would take pride in brewing it so strong that it would float a horseshoe, etc., was the way that they put it. So by the time of the Civil War, America had become a real coffee drinking country, not very good coffee. Uh, we had we basically were roasting it at home. You'd buy the beans from your local store or from wherever you could get them from, and they would be usually burned on the outside and raw on the inside. Although at least it was fresh, and that was an important point. But um, they eventually, uh, during the Civil War, uh, someone invented a new kind of roaster which would was commercially viable, uh, and it would dump the beans out at the end. It was a guy named Jabez Burns, and at the same time, somebody had invented a paper bag for peanuts. And then the Arbuckle brothers got this bright idea of roasting the beans and then covering them with a glaze made from egg and sugar to to coat them with to try to keep them somewhat fresh. And also, then when you brewed it, it included the sugar. Uh, and this was fantastically successful as the first commercial product. And after that, you began to get places like Chase and Sanborn, uh, Folgers was Folgers was started in San Francisco by the Folger brothers, who had come from a whaling family on Nantucket. They were mentioned in Moby Dick, as a matter of fact. But they decided that they would make their fortune by providing coffee for the 49ers who were coming for the gold rush.
Wait, and so
So
what year was that?
um, they invented Folgers somewhere in the 1850s.
Wow.
Yeah, a long time ago. And then Chase and Sanborn in the Boston area began sometime after the Civil War. Maxwell House Coffee was started by Joel Cheek in Nashville. And so there were all kinds and Hills Brothers began also on the West Coast. Eventually, Hills Brothers figured out that you could vacuum pack coffee in cans and try to keep it somewhat fresh. A big problem with coffee has always been keeping it fresh, because when you um, roast the coffee bean, it begins to produce carbon dioxide for about 24 hours. And so if you pack it fresh, it would break the container. And that was true of the Hills Brothers also. So they had to roast it and then allow it to degas, which meant allowing it to get somewhat stale, because coffee is also it's a real no-no to let it be associated with oxygen for very long. And so,
Hmm. Yeah,
um,
it molds very fast. Am I right?
well, it isn't that it molds; it just becomes stale. It tastes flat,
Got it.
and so they they would learn they tried to vacuum pack them, but eventually it wasn't until the 60s or 70s that somebody realized that you could put them in a plastic bag, a multi-layered bag with a one-way valve on it, which allowed the carbon dioxide to go out, but it wouldn't let air go in. And that has really revolutionized specialty coffee and allowed good coffee to be kept uh, without too much air getting into it. So for maybe 6 months or so.
Wow.
So that's something you should look for when you buy coffee. You should also try to make sure that it's 100% Arabica coffee, which is uh, the superior brand.
Wow. So I was just looking it up here. Is it Gillies or Gillies coffee is the oldest, and it was right around 1840. So Folgers, within 10 years, might be the second oldest coffee company or right up there, somewhere in there.
Hmm. Yeah, Gillies is how you pronounce it, and that's in New York. And Donald Schoenholt is the CEO of that, and he's one of the leaders of the specialty coffee industry, and also somebody who's very interested in coffee history. And he helped me a lot with when I was doing the research for my book.
Oh, it's awesome. And so I mean I drink Folgers, all right. So I just that's all I maybe I just fell in love with it because of their great marketing in the 80s. I'm sure you remember that. The music, I'm sure they still have the same song. I don't watch TV that much anymore, but they're great marketers, and that's probably why I
About
still
getting
drink
up
it.
in the morning with Folgers in your cup. Well, I
Yeah.
hate to tell you, but you're drinking pretty bad coffee. If I were you, I would try to go to your local specialty coffee shop and try something else because Folgers usually has, in the 1960s, it used to be fairly good, but all of the major coffee roasters began to put worse and worse coffee beans in their product because they were engaged in a price war with one another, and coffee became commodified instead of the sort of it used to be kind of like wine that you would appreciate the different places that it came from, and that's now has become quite true that many people are totally hepped up on that the coffee comes from the high mountains of Guatemala or Kenya or Ethiopia, where it started, or Papua New Guinea, and they all, because of the quote terroir, the quality of the ground in which it's grown, or uh, the air around it, it all tastes somewhat different. And also now they are processing the coffee in many different ways. You can process it by the natural method, which is just to let it uh, put it, pick off the red uh, ripe beans, put them on the ground on a plastic mat or uh, a sheet, and then turn them and hope that the sun will dry them evenly. The problem is that that's very susceptible to the mold that you were talking about. And you have to be extremely careful in doing that. So then the better beans began to be processed by what's known as the wet method, where you would rip off the uh, ripe outside of the coffee bean and uh, and then put it in water for 24 to 48 hours and allow it to ferment, where the pulp on the outside would then come off easily because it sticks
Hmm.
pretty well to the seed, um, and then roast it. The problem with that is that unless you're very careful, if you wash that stuff down into the river, then it pollutes the river, kills the fish, etc. So there's been a big movement to try to get people to uh, take the outside of the coffee and then use it for compost. Let it and put in worms and let it become enriched and things like that. So it's complicated. And then now that they are doing something called the honey process, where they will strip off the outside of the coffee bean and let it dry, and then strip off the outside, and that adds a certain quality to the beans as well. So there's a lot to explore, and basically for entrepreneurs that your program is aimed after, there are now barista contests. There are all kinds of guides to how to start your own coffee house. Um, there is a big movement to try to help the poor people who grow the coffee. You know, most coffee is grown by people who make about $3 to $5 a day, whereas that's how much you can pay for a good cup of coffee at a Starbucks or elsewhere. So, um, to combat that, uh, there's been a big push for fair trade coffee, which basically gives you a minimum wage for coffee growers. It's not very high, it's not sufficient, but it's something. And then there's a big movement for direct trade where people are buying coffee directly from a farm and trying to cut out the middlemen, and giving back the money that way. And so many roasters are trying to do that, and have formed a relationship, and even will go down to South America or to Africa, to the places where coffee is grown, and try to help them to grow their coffee in a sustainable way that it also tastes a lot better. So it it really has become sort of the avatar for a lot of knowledge about where the particular coffee is coming from.
What type of coffee do you drink then? Or do you drink coffee even?
I do drink coffee, and I generally will try coffee from different places. I'm particularly fond of coffee from Ethiopia. Um, there's something called Yirgacheffe, which is a good source, or Sidamo. Um, and I like Kenya Double A. I'm particularly fond of some Rwandan coffee has become notable in recent years. Um, Guatemalan Antigua is really good. And of course, Jamaica Blue Mountain and Hawaiian Kona are very famous. And they're good, but they're mostly expensive because they're rare, which is another thing you find. And you know, people will become obsessed with all kinds of different kinds of coffee. Like the most expensive coffee in the world is called Kopi Luwak. That's um, coffee which is processed by the wet method, so to speak, by the civet cat, where it's not a cat, it's a marsupial, but they eat the ripest coffee beans and then shit them out,
Yeah.
and it adds a certain quality. I call it a gutsy taste to the beans, and they're rare, so they cost a lot. And people have developed a taste for these things, and but mostly, I think it's hype. Like somebody was trying to make elephant coffee the same way by feeding elephants coffee beans, and I think it's very silly because they don't strip their digestive system doesn't strip the beans, the pulp off of the beans, and so it doesn't really impact the taste particularly, but people, you know, think it does, and so there's this huge movement to try to get them to grow uh, coffee and feed it to elephants,
There's a
things like
movie
that.
called The Bucket List, and it talks about Kopi Luwak. Have you ever heard of this movie?
I've heard of that movie. Yeah.
Jack Nicholson and who is it? I don't know. He's a it's his friend who is about to die, And so
Right.
Jack Nicholson's this very rich guy, and he basically says he only drinks Kopi Luwak. And at the very end of the movie, he explains what Kopi Luwak is really made of. And that's for the first time these super elite rich people do drink Kopi Luwak. Is that right?
Sometimes, yeah,
Very expensive
it
stuff.
is.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So, what did you, okay, I wanted to add two more questions. One, is there a downfall of coffee? Is there anything that you've come across that shows maybe if you drink shit coffee, it leads to X, Y, and Z? And then the next question I have is in regards to Starbucks. I believe, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but Starbucks was the first really big hit to United States of let's just create a coffee shop for the enjoyment of getting together just to have coffee and nothing else. So those two questions,
Hmm.
whichever one you want to start with.
Well, in terms of Starbucks, it had been one of the early um, uh, specialty coffee houses. There was a guy named Alfred Peet, who was a Dutchman who had moved to San Francisco, and he was disgusted by the terrible coffee, and so he started the first Peet's coffee in Berkeley in 1966, and that inspired three friends in Seattle to start Starbucks. And they had no intention of making a coffee house. They wanted to, and they did, uh, provide good beans for people who wanted to roast them at home, and but mostly they roasted them themselves, and they went down for pilgrimages to Pete's to learn how to do it. And they hired a guy named Howard Schultz uh, to help them sell their coffee, and he was sent to Milan in Italy for a conference where he went to the local espresso shops, and he was really impressed with the theater of the baristas there and how they knew all their customers and they brewed this coffee in this special way and to make espresso. And so he decided that that's what Starbucks should do, that they should make their own uh, coffee and that they should sell it in coffee houses. And he had read a book by Ray Oldenburg called The Great Good Place about this theory that you needed a third place outside of home and outside of work where people could gather together. And it used to be that soda fountains provided that place, but they had mostly gone out by the 1980s. And so Schultz began transforming Starbucks into the coffee houses we know now. And eventually he bought out uh, the original partners of Starbucks, who themselves had bought out Pete's. So,
Wow, I didn't know that. They bought
yeah,
out the other competition at that time.
they did. Jerry Baldwin did, who was the one of the original three partners. And so it's become quite a fascinating thing. A lot of people criticize Starbucks because much of what they sell is milk rather than coffee.
Lattes,
Um,
yeah.
um, but you can get very good coffee there. In terms of health issues, it's interesting that um, Arabica coffee, anyway, the sort of higher quality brand, it used to be thought that it caused uh, maybe heart attacks or pancreatic cancer or breast lumps. And that was in the early 80s. And that was the origin of a lot of the success of decaffeinated coffee.
Wow.
But now, uh, larger epidemiological studies have largely exonerated coffee, at least taken in moderation, like 3 or 4 cups a day. And not only that, it's actually good for you,
Yes.
apparently, that it can help to prevent Alzheimer's, or at least fewer people have Alzheimer's who drink or coffee, liver cancer, uh, type 2 diabetes. Um, so it's actually apparently relatively good for you. One other thing I was going to mention is I thought you were going to ask what the biggest threat to coffee was now, and it's really climate change. Because coffee is having to be grown higher and higher up mountains, or it's going to have to shift uh, towards away from the equator more because it's getting too hot. And because of the heat, the good coffee is being plagued more by a fungus called coffee leaf rust or Himalaya vastastrix, which killed the coffee in the East Indies back in the late 1800s, and then it spread to this hemisphere, and it's been really devastating in recent years to a lot of coffee, and they're trying to produce hybrid forms that will resist the coffee rust, but often those don't taste as good. And so it's it's going to be more and more difficult, I think, by good coffee to be grown. In the meantime, Vietnam became a huge grower of some of the not very good coffee of the world, and has taken over as the second largest coffee grower producer in the world.
Brazil, and then you said the Philippines or Vietnam,
Vietnam
Vietnam.
and then Colombia. It used to be Brazil and then Colombia. Now Vietnam has taken over from that, which I don't think is a very good thing, but that's the way of the world. So it's a complicated business. You can make a lot of money from it. You can also lose your shirt because coffee is one of the more volatile priced products in the world. There's a boom bust cycle that happens where there will be too much coffee produced, and then the price will tank, and then people will uh, they, they will stop pruning their trees, or they'll even cut them down, and eventually that means that the price will then go back up, and people will say, "Oh, this is a good deal. Now I'm going to plant more coffee." But it takes like 5 years for a coffee tree to grow and produce coffee. So there's a a time lag, and then there will be too much coffee again eventually, and the whole cycle will start all over again. And in my book, I talked about people, in Papua New Guinea who had no idea what was going on with any of this. They had these tribes who hardly had ever seen a mirror were um, working hard to grow coffee, and then suddenly the price collapsed. There was something called the International Coffee Agreement, which had tried to stabilize coffee prices, and it collapsed in 1989, and that's when uh, there was a documentary called Black Coffee that showed how the terrible thing that happened to these tribes because of the collapse of coffee prices, which happened because of international movements, which they had no clue what was going on with.
Did you come across any incredible stats of how many people drink coffee on a day-to-day basis? My only assumption is behind water, it is the number one liquid that is consumed in America. I may be wrong about that, but that's what I believe, simply because it is a drug. It's a legal drug. Went off coffee. I didn't believe in addiction. I went off coffee
Mm-hmm.
for 3 days. I did not think straight for 3 days until I got back on coffee. It's amazing how your body becomes so accustomed to it and it almost requires it to function at a certain level. So, have you come across any stats and any science behind maybe why it's so addictive? Anything you could share with our audience?
Well, you're right that coffee is probably the second most widely drunk beverage on earth after water. Tea is very close. So they argue with each other about that. Um, Caffeine is an addictive drug. Um, and if you stop getting it and you're used to it, you'll go through some withdrawal symptoms, such as you did, which generally last about 3 to 5 days. And you can not only not think clearly, you can actually, vomit or, have really severe reactions to it.
Headaches.
Most people get over it in 3 to 5 days. If you really wanted to get off coffee, uh, you might be psychologically more addicted to it than physiologically after a week. But after a week, you're probably going to flush it from your system and be fine. It's not a terribly severe reaction. And as I said, the good news is it's not a terrible addiction to have. Um,
Right.
it's
It's somewhat of a healthy substance, right? Maybe it is healthy, right? Like you said, it helps out with maybe fighting cancer, fighting off Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it can do that. So um, I wouldn't worry too much about it if I were you, but I would drink better coffee than Folgers. But it's cheaper to drink Folgers, so why
Yeah,
not?
well, maybe I just go. It's something I've drank my whole life, so it's almost like, wow, it's been working for me. Why break it? And yeah, maybe it tastes a little better, but I'm a man. I can handle it. That's the way I looked at it. So, you might have changed
Right.
my mind on this podcast. But is there a website or any social media channel that you're on, or you recommend people check out in addition to the books that you have on Amazon?
Well, my website is my name is www.markpendergrast.com. Um, and there are all kinds of websites about specialty coffee and podcasts and whatever else about the wonders of good coffee. So you can consult those whenever, just go and do a Google search.
Beautiful. And guys, check out his other books. I'm just going to pull up a few of them here. For God, Country, and Coca-Cola. I want to check that out. I drank Coca-Cola when I was growing up my whole life, and now I will never touch it. But maybe there's something in that book that really will shock me even more. So, pretty wild. You have a few other books. One that really got a lot of attention, I think, The Most Hated Man in America, the Jerry Sandusky and the Rush to Judgment. Pretty amazing. So, I think
Yeah,
you,
I think Jerry Sandusky is innocent, and it's a controversial stand to take. But if you actually read my book, you will see that he is very likely to be innocent.
wow, you are one of the few saying that. So I guarantee the criticism that you got is pretty substantial. I want to check out some of those reviews on there. But anyways, guys, he has many books. I think Mark Pendergrass sounds like an author's name. You have an author's name, Mark, just so you know. It's you found
Thank
your
you.
calling. There's no doubt about it. But thank you so much for sharing some of that insight with coffee. I probably will drink. What's funny is I'm drinking out of a Black Rifle coffee mug right now. So,
Hmm.
I might have to upgrade my Folgers to something a little bit better. And I've been hearing that from my friends recently. So you might have moved the needle, but I appreciate your time, guys. Check out his books, look at his website, markpendergrass.com. And remember, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.